June 24th, 1941, early morning, a crossroads outside the Lithuanian town of Raseiniai. Through his observation slit, the Soviet tank commander watches a German supply convoy approach 800 yards down the road. Trucks laden with wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, fuel, and ammunition lumber forward, their drivers unaware of what awaits them. The commander gives a quiet order. The loader shoves a high-explosive shell into the breach. The gunner lines up the crosshairs on the lead vehicle. Seconds later, the propellant ignites with a thundering crack. The shell screams down the barrel and slams into the first truck, causing it to erupt in a fireball. Shot after shot follows in quick succession. Within minutes, nearly a dozen trucks are burning wrecks. The vehicles in the rear make a hasty retreat. The Soviet crew has just announced their presence to the German 6th Panzer Division in the most dramatic way possible. And now the Germans are coming for them. What follows will become one of the most legendary single-tank actions in military history. A lone KV-1 heavy tank, cut off from its unit, crew unknown, holding a vital crossroads against an entire Panzer division for more than 24 hours. A 45-ton steel monster that German guns cannot penetrate. A crew that refuses to surrender even when all hope is lost. The Germans will throw everything they have at this one tank. Anti-tank guns, howitzers, Panzers, engineers with satchel charges, even their feared 88mm anti-aircraft guns. And for day and night, the Soviet crew will fight them all. This is the story of the Battle of Raseiniai and the tank that wouldn't die. June 22nd, 1941, early morning, the biggest military operation in human history begins. Around 150 divisions of the Wehrmacht cross the Soviet border in a surprise attack that will eventually involve more than 3 million men. Adolf Hitler has launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German confidence is sky high. The Wehrmacht has conquered Poland in weeks, defeated France in 6 weeks, and overrun most of Western Europe. The German military machine seems unstoppable. Hitler and his generals believe the Soviet Union will collapse within months, possibly weeks. They are about to receive a very unpleasant education. The German offensive is organized into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North drives toward Leningrad. Army Group Center aims for Moscow. Army Group South pushes toward Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields. Each army group possesses overwhelming firepower, highly trained troops, and most importantly, fast-moving panzer divisions that have perfected the art of blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe strikes first. German aircraft bomb Soviet airfields at dawn, destroying hundreds of Soviet planes before they can even get airborne. Within hours, the Luftwaffe achieves air superiority across most of the front. Soviet forces are caught completely by surprise, despite numerous intelligence warnings Stalin had ignored. On the ground, German panzer divisions punch through Soviet defensive positions with shocking ease. The Soviet military is in chaos. Many commanders don't even know they're at war until German shells start falling. Communication breaks down, units become separated, entire armies are encircled. In the northern sector, Army Group North drives toward the Baltic states. Their objective: capture key cities, secure crossings over the Niemen and Daugava rivers, and ultimately push to Leningrad. Leading the advance is the 4th Panzer Army, a powerful formation equipped with hundreds of tanks and supported by motorized infantry. The 4th Panzer Army's 3 panzer divisions spearhead the attack, with their flanks covered by infantry and motorized units. The Soviet rifle divisions they encounter have insufficient means to stop German armor. After conceding initial losses, Soviet forces are forced to yield ground. Gaps in the defensive line appear and are mercilessly exploited by more mobile German units. The first day of the war looks very promising for the Germans, but on June 23rd, something changes. Soviet rifle regiments might lack effective anti-tank weapons, but the Red Army has something the Germans don't know about: heavy tanks, lots of them. On June 23rd, 2 Soviet tank divisions drive in from the north to support crumbling infantry on the German flank. The 23rd and 28th Tank Divisions arrive equipped with T-26 and BT-7 light tanks. Both are solid vehicles, but vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. The Soviet counterattack barely stalls German progress, and only locally. The 3 German panzer divisions make considerable progress, breaking Soviet opposition and capturing the town of Raseiniai. Reconnaissance battalions of the 6th Panzer Division push forward to seize crossings on the Dubica River. They succeed in securing a bridgehead on the far side, victory seems certain, and then, on the afternoon of June 23rd, another Soviet unit arrives. The 2nd Tank Division, under Major General Yegor Solyankin, reaches the perimeter of the German reconnaissance battalion. What happens next shocks the Germans to their core. Solyankin's tanks literally roll over the German positions, crushing foxholes, destroying vehicles, and pushing the reconnaissance battalion back toward Raseiniai. But this isn't an attack by T-26 or BT-7s. This is something the Germans have never encountered before. Emerging from the dust and smoke come massive steel behemoths. Tanks larger than anything in the German arsenal. Tanks with armor so thick that German anti-tank guns are useless. Tanks with guns powerful enough to destroy any German vehicle with a single shot. The Kliment Voroshilov heavy tank, the KV for short. The KV tank came in 2 main versions. The KV-1 mounted a potent 76mm gun. The KV-2 had a bigger turret to fit a monstrous 152mm howitzer-like cannon. Both versions were protected by thick armor all around, weighing well over 40 tons. The KV was designed for one purpose: breakthrough operations, to smash through enemy defensive lines that would stop lighter tanks, to absorb punishment that would destroy other vehicles, to dominate the battlefield. In June 1941, the KV easily outgunned any fighting vehicle the German Wehrmacht possessed. Its 90mm frontal armor made it virtually invincible to standard German anti-tank weapons. The 37mm anti-tank guns that had worked well against Polish and French tanks were useless. The 50mm guns were barely better. Even the most capable early versions of the Panzer IV medium tank couldn't penetrate KV armor from the front. German tankers, fresh from swift victories in Poland and France, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't hurt. Panic spread through German units encountering KVs for the first time. Reports flooded back to headquarters describing invincible Soviet tanks that shrugged off direct hits and destroyed German vehicles with impunity. As one German officer later wrote, "Our companies opened fire at about 800 yards, but it remained ineffective. We moved closer and closer to the enemy, who for his part continued to advance unconcerned. Very soon we were facing each other at 50 to 100 yards. A fantastic engagement opened up without any German progress. The Russian tanks continued to advance, and all armor-piercing shells simply bounced off them." Solyankin's attack, spearheaded by KV tanks, drove the Germans most of the way back to Raseiniai. It should have been a decisive Soviet victory, but the attack began to lose momentum. The KV had critical weaknesses. Its transmission was unreliable. Most lacked onboard radios, making coordinated maneuvers nearly impossible in the heat of battle. Without radio communication, KV crews couldn't coordinate their attacks or call for infantry support. Due to these limitations, Solyankin's tanks soon diverged and set off on individual battles rather than focusing on a single objective. Cohesion was lost. The fighting became harder without sufficient infantry support. German troops, recovering from their initial shock, adapted. They destroyed some tanks using satchel charges. They immobilized others by shooting at their tracks. But even separated and lacking coordination, the KV tanks still posed a massive threat to the German 6th Panzer Division. And one of those separated vehicles was about to become legendary. A single KV tank, cut off from Solyankin's division, wandered northwest. Its crew found a good defensive position, a crossroads on a vital supply road north of Raseiniai. It's unclear if they chose this position deliberately or simply took cover where they happened to be. Either way, they had unwittingly broken communication between sections of the northern battle group of the German 6th Panzer Division. There's still debate about whether this tank was a KV-1 or KV-2. The KV-2, with its enormous turret mounting a preposterously big 152mm howitzer, makes for a more dramatic story. But the KV-1 was more reliable, more numerous, and carried 3 times as much main gun ammunition. For this telling, we'll assume it was a KV-1. Not that it mattered much to the Germans. Either version was nearly invincible. On the morning of June 24th, the KV crew spotted the German supply convoy approaching. Trucks laden with wounded soldiers, POWs, fuel, and ammunition, easy targets. The commander gave the order, the loader loaded, the gunner aimed, the gun fired, the first truck exploded, then another. then another. Within minutes, nearly a dozen vehicles were burning wrecks blocking the road. The surviving trucks in the rear fled back toward German lines. The KV had just announced its presence, and it had just cut the main supply line to roughly half of the entire 6th Panzer Division, stalling its advance deeper into Soviet territory. German commanders faced an unprecedented situation. The main objective of a battle group that was supposed to be driving toward Leningrad had suddenly become the elimination of one enemy tank. One tank blocking a road. How hard could it be? The Germans' first attempt was straightforward. A battery of 50mm anti-tank guns was positioned some distance from the tank. These guns had worked well against Polish and French armor. Surely they would work against the KV. The German gunners opened fire, direct hits. The shells struck the KV's armor with metallic clangs and bounced off, disintegrating on impact or dropping to the ground like bags of wet sand. "We didn't penetrate their armor," one gunner reported. "That one didn't go through," shouted another. Inside the KV, the crew covered their ears as rounds pounded mercilessly against their tank. The noise was deafening, but they were unhurt. The armor held. Soon the KV's turret began to move. The Soviet gunner had located the German gun battery. One by one, the KV destroyed them. Within minutes, the battery was reduced to mangled hunks of smoldering wreckage. The Germans tried again. A 105mm field howitzer was brought up. Its crew tried to get it into a suitable firing position, but the KV commander spotted the threat. Without hesitation, they fired. The shells slammed into the howitzer, taking it out of action before it could fire a single shot. German commanders began to realize this would not be easy. Next, they tried flanking the tank. More than 700 yards to the KV's rear, an 88mm flak gun was laboriously towed into position. The 88 was Germany's most feared anti-tank weapon, originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, but equally deadly against armor. Capable of propelling shells at nearly 2,700 feet per second, the 88 could penetrate even the KV's thick armor. But the crew had to get into position first, and the KV crew was vigilant. The Soviet commander spotted the 88 being set up. He ordered the turret traversed nearly 180 degrees. The gunner aimed. They fired before the 88 could get a shot off. Another German gun reduced to burning scrap metal. By now, German commanders were incredulous. A single tank had destroyed multiple anti-tank guns, a field howitzer, and an 88. Standard anti-tank tactics weren't working. They needed a different approach. As darkness fell on June 24th, German infantry prepared for a stealth operation. A squad of combat engineers, clutching grenades and satchel charges, crept toward the tank. The plan was simple. Sneak up under cover of darkness, place 25 kilograms of explosives against the hull or tracks, and blow the tank apart. They moved carefully through the darkness, getting closer and closer to the slumbering steel beast. 50 yards, 40, 30. Suddenly, the KV's machine gun erupted. Tracers cut through the darkness. The engineers who weren't hit immediately dove for cover and retreated. The crew was still awake, still vigilant. The Germans managed to get one explosive charge onto the tank's tracks. It detonated with a sharp crack. Success! One track was damaged, slipping partially off its wheels. The KV wasn't going anywhere now, but it could still fire, and its gun still worked perfectly. Dawn broke on June 25th. The KV remained at the Crossroads, immobile but deadly. German commanders knew they had to finish this. They decided to throw everything they had at the tank. Shortly after daybreak, the Germans launched their coordinated attack. The plan required misdirection. Panzer 35T light tanks, Czech-made vehicles weighing just 10 tons and mounting 37mm guns, would attack from one direction. They couldn't hurt the KV, but they would distract the crew. While the KV dealt with the Panzers, two 88mm guns that had been moved into position during the night would fire from the opposite direction. The Panzers attacked. At just 10 tons with relatively thin armor, the Panzer 35s were hopelessly outclassed by the 45-ton Soviet beast. But they advanced anyway, guns blazing, shells bouncing harmlessly off the KV's armor. The Soviet gunner engaged the Panzers. The turret turned toward them. This was what the Germans had been waiting for. The 88mm guns fired. High-velocity, armor-piercing rounds streaked across 700 yards and slammed into the KV's side armor where it was thinnest. 2 rounds penetrated. The KV fell silent. German soldiers waited, watching for fire, for an explosion, for a white flag to appear from an open hatch. Nothing. Cautiously, infantry began approaching the crippled tank. And then, through the haze and smoke, the turret began to move again. Battered, damaged. But the stubborn Soviet crew was still in the fight. The turret swung toward the approaching infantry. The Germans fled. One soldier, in desperation or rage, threw a grenade through one of the holes the 88mm shells had torn in the armor. The grenade exploded inside the tank with a mighty clang. This time, the gun fell silent. For good. For more than 24 hours, a single KV-1 had held off elements of an entire Panzer division. Its crew had destroyed a dozen supply trucks, multiple 50mm anti-tank guns, a 105mm field howitzer, at least one 88mm flak gun, possibly 2, several Panzer 35T light tanks, all while blocking a vital supply road and preventing half of the 6th Panzer Division from advancing. According to German General Erhard Rauss, who later wrote about the engagement, the German troops approached the destroyed tank with a mixture of anger and respect. What they found inside silenced any thoughts of revenge. The Soviet crew was dead, all of them. They had fought to the last man, refusing to surrender even when their situation was hopeless. General Rauss ordered that the dead tankmen be recovered and buried with full military honors. The crew's identities were never definitively determined, but decades after the battle, remains of Russian soldiers buried near the Crossroads were exhumed and reburied at the Soviet military cemetery in Raseiniai. It's widely believed they belonged to the KV-1 crew. They had earned the Germans' respect the hard way. While the lone KV held its Crossroads, the situation for Major General Solyankin's 2nd Tank Division became critical. The Germans, after recovering from their initial shock, regained composure and brought up additional units. Over the next 2 days, the Soviet division was fully encircled. Cut off from supply and reinforcement, Solyankin's tanks were systematically destroyed. The division was bled out in fierce fighting. Major General Yegor Solyankin perished in battle. Only a single BT-7 tank and 400 men managed to escape the encirclement. The 2nd Tank Division effectively ceased to exist. The Battle of Raseiniai ended in tactical defeat for the Soviets. The German advance continued, delayed, but not stopped. Within days, Army Group North would push deeper into the Baltic states, eventually reaching the outskirts of Leningrad by September. But strategically, the battle revealed something far more significant. The Germans' assumptions about the superiority of their Panzer Corps were too optimistic. The KV and its sister heavy tank, the T-34, were superior to anything in the German arsenal in mid-1941. German soldiers had experienced firsthand what it meant to face an enemy tank that their weapons couldn't penetrate. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time since the war began, German tank crews felt fear. Reports from Raseiniai and similar encounters across the Eastern Front flooded back to German high command. The messages were urgent and consistent. Soviet heavy tanks are invincible to our current weapons. The implications were staggering. Germany's Panzer divisions, which had conquered most of Europe, were suddenly technologically obsolete. The Wehrmacht faced an enemy with superior armor that could only be destroyed by specialized weapons, 88mm guns that were difficult to deploy and highly vulnerable to enemy fire. Something had to be done. Immediately, German industry received new orders. Development programs for heavier tanks, better suited to the evolving battlefield, were given top priority. Engineers who had been working on improved versions of existing tanks were redirected to design entirely new vehicles. The requirements were clear: thick armor that could withstand Soviet guns, powerful weapons capable of penetrating heavy armor at range, and reliability for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Roughly a year later, in August 1942, the first of these new vehicles entered service. Though it had a lengthy initial designation, Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung Arch, the tank became better known by its more popular nickname, the Tiger. The Tiger was Germany's answer to the KV. With 100mm of frontal armor and an 88mm gun as its main armament, the Tiger could engage and destroy heavy Soviet tanks at long range. It was exactly what German tank crews had been begging for. But the Tiger came too late to affect the outcome of the war. By the time Tigers arrived in significant numbers, the Soviets had improved their own designs. The T-34 was upgraded, new heavy tanks entered production, and most importantly, Soviet industry was producing tanks at a rate Germany could never match. For every Tiger Germany built, the Soviets produced a dozen T-34s. German tanks might be superior individually, but the Soviets had numbers. And in the end, numbers won. The story of the lone K-5 at Raseiniai became legendary on both sides. German veterans told the story for decades afterward, describing the seemingly invincible tank that held off an entire division. Soviet historians celebrated it as an example of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The incident demonstrated several important lessons about tank warfare. First, technology matters. A technologically superior tank operated by a determined crew can achieve results far beyond what numbers suggest. The KV's thick armor meant it could sit in the open and trade shots with multiple enemies, destroying them one by one while remaining invulnerable. Second, tactics matter. The KV crew positioned their tank well, using the Crossroads to control a vital choke point. They engaged enemies at appropriate ranges, prioritizing the biggest threats first. They maintained vigilance even when exhausted. Good tactics multiplied the tank's inherent advantages. Third, morale matters. The Soviet crew could have abandoned their tank when it became clear they were cut off. They could have surrendered when the situation became hopeless. Instead, they fought to the death. That kind of determination cannot be quantified in military planning, but it can decide battles. Fourth, combined arms matter. The lone K-5 was eventually destroyed because it lacked infantry support. If Soviet infantry had been present to protect the tank from German engineers, if Soviet artillery had provided fire support, if Soviet aircraft had attacked German positions, the outcome might have been different. Tanks operating alone, no matter how powerful, are vulnerable. For the Germans, Raseiniai was a victory, but an uncomfortable one. Yes, they had destroyed Solyankin's division. Yes, they had eventually eliminated the lone KV. Yes, they continued their advance toward Leningrad. But the cost was higher than expected. German losses in tanks and anti-tank guns were significant. More importantly, German confidence was shaken. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. Soviet tanks were not inferior. The war in the East would not be a repeat of France. And the delays mattered. Every day spent fighting at Raseiniai was a day not spent advancing toward Leningrad. Every tank destroyed was one less available for future battles. Every soldier killed was irreplaceable. Germany's manpower was limited, while the Soviet Union's was vast. The Battle of Raseiniai was, in the bigger picture, just a brief pause in the German advance deep into Soviet territory, but it was part of a pattern. All across the front, German forces were encountering fiercer resistance than expected. Soviet troops were fighting with determination that surprised the Germans. Soviet tanks were better than intelligence had suggested. Soviet commanders were learning quickly from their mistakes. The quick victory Hitler expected was not materializing. Operation Barbarossa would not end in weeks. It would drag on for months, then years, and ultimately it would fail. Today, Raseiniai is a quiet town in central Lithuania. Few traces remain of the battle that raged there in June 1941. The crossroads where the lone KV made its stand looks much as it did then, a simple intersection of rural roads surrounded by fields. But in the Soviet military cemetery in Raseiniai, there are graves that may hold the remains of that unknown crew. Soldiers whose names were lost, but whose actions were remembered. Men who died fighting against impossible odds, achieving nothing strategically but everything symbolically. They demonstrated that Soviet soldiers would fight, that Soviet tanks could match German armor, that the Wehrmacht's advance, though seemingly unstoppable, could be delayed and bloodied. June 1941, Raseiniai, Lithuania, where a single tank crew held a crossroads for 24 hours, where German anti-tank guns bounced shells off thick Soviet armor, where 5 men, driver, commander, gunner, loader, and machine gunner, fought an entire Panzer division and earned the respect of the enemy they died fighting. Their names are lost to history, but their story endures. The story of the K-5 that wouldn't die, the crew that wouldn't surrender, The battle that revealed the Eastern Front would not be the easy victory Germany expected. In the mythology of tank warfare, they hold a special place, not for tactical brilliance or strategic importance, but for pure, stubborn defiance, for refusing to quit when any rational person would have, for fighting on when all hope was gone. They were buried with military honors by the very enemy they had fought so fiercely. That, perhaps more than anything, tells you what kind of soldiers they were. The tank that wouldn't die, the crew that earned immortality, the forgotten heroes of Raseiniai.